Welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I am Dale, and I am joined by Christoph.
Hey, Dale. It's good to be with you again, and hey, audience.
Yes, it's 2:14 in the morning off the Moroccan coast, and the water off Fidela is doing something water almost never does during an invasion. It's staying quiet. No searchlights, no sirens, no flag climbing into a black sky. Just the low groan of 102 American ships holding formation 8 miles offshore, engines throttled back, running lights dark, 17,000 men below decks checking rifle actions they've already checked 4 times. Hold that image. A fleet the size of a small city, sitting off a foreign coast in the pitch dark. And nobody on shore has the faintest idea it's there. Now, hold on to a second image next to it. 6,000 miles away and 2 years earlier, a French government signs a piece of paper in a railway car at Nya. The same railway car, as it happens, where Germany once signed its own surrender in 1918. The armistice France signs there in June 1940 does not end France's war. It ends France's ability to fight it. What's left of the French government operating out of the resort town of Vichy keeps its colonies, keeps a rump navy and army, and keeps one binding obligation to Berlin: defend French territory, including French Morocco, against anyone who tries to take it. Anyone. That word is about to matter a great deal. This is the strategic knot Casablanca sits inside, and it's worth sitting with it before a single shot gets fired, because nothing about what happens on November 1942 makes sense without it. The United States and Vichy France are not at war. Washington still maintains a diplomatic mission to the Vichy government. American planners running Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa, have bet the entire operation on a theory that French troops in Morocco and Algeria, given an American face on the invasion rather than a British one, will decline to fight hard. Maybe not fight at all. The British get remembered for Mare Calabert, where the Royal Navy shelled a French fleet in 1940 to keep it out of the German hands, killing over 1,000 French sailors who used to be their allies. That memory is radioactive in every French wardroom in North Africa. So Torch goes in under the American flag on the theory that the French will recognize a friend and stand down. It is, in hindsight, a very expensive theory to test. Task Force 34 sails from Chesapeake Bay on October 23rd, gathers a covering force of battleships and cruisers out of Casco Bay, Maine, on the 26th, and picks up the carrier USS Ranger and 3 escort carriers out of Bermuda on the 28th. 38 destroyers screening the whole formation across 3,000 miles of Atlantic. That is, this deep into 1942, still infested with German U-boats. Command rests with Rear Admiral Henry Ken Hewitt, flying his flag on the heavy cruiser USS Augusta. The landing force belongs to Major General George S. Patton, and somewhere in the transports behind them are 35,000 American soldiers who, as far as most of them know, are sailing towards a fight against people who are supposed to be neutral. Here's what none of them know yet. 5 days before the landing, a British submarine, HMS Sephra, surfaced off Algiers in the dark and put ashore Major General Mark Clark for a clandestine meeting with the sympathetic French officers. A meeting that produced exactly nothing useful, because the men Clark talked to were mostly Army, not Navy, and none of them had the authority to guarantee Casablanca would open its arms. Nobody told Vice Admiral Francois Michelia, universally known in the French Navy by his nickname Freaks, anything at all. Michelia commands every French warship in Casablanca harbor. He'd taken the post less than a month earlier, coming off a stint on the Armistice Commission itself, the body that enforced Vichy's obligations to Germany. He is, by background and by very recent assignment, the single worst man in Morocco for the Americans to be counting on to stand aside. And he's about to find 102 American ships sitting off his coast at dawn with absolutely no warning that they were coming. Two fleets are about to fight a battle neither side declared over a piece of paper signed in a railway car for reasons that will look almost insane in the history books and made a strange kind of sense in the moment. Michelia has his orders: defend Moroccan neutrality against any power that violates it. Full stop. No exceptions carved out for a friendly one. Hewitt has his: get 35,000 men and their equipment onto a hostile shore, somewhere on the Jean Bar, the most powerful gun in French Morocco, is sitting in its turret, incomplete, undermanned, and about to fire in anger for the first time. Dawn is less than 5 hours away.
This is a really interesting setup. I know a lot of folks talk about France's position at the beginning of World War I and how they were quickly taken over by the Germans. But what happens after that, I think, as you're describing, is very relevant. Like they have to walk this tightrope of being occupied, still being France, still maintaining a hold on their colonies and territory, but at the same time being under the fealty of Germany. And so this is, I had not heard about that story that you mentioned about the British shelling the French ships to keep them out of German hands and killing 1,000 French sailors. That is, yeah, that would leave a bad taste in my mouth as a French person as well. Golly, that's something else. This is very risky. I think the operation that they're trying to execute, the United States, the Allies, I should say, trying to get a landing on the North African shores and counting on the cooperation of a potential ally whose hands are tied, frankly. This is, I don't know, this is a gamble. And it's clear probably from all my stammering that I have not heard of this conflict. I have not heard of that. The World War II I have. This chapter of it, I'm ignorant of. And I know that the Allies have fought in North Africa against the Axis powers. But how they got there, I never really thought about. And so this will be a very interesting, I guess, story and education for me.
Let's put both fleets on the table, because you cannot follow what happens over the next 3 days without knowing exactly what's sitting in the water on the morning of November 8th, 1942. American strength splits into 3 landing groups spread across 150 miles of Moroccan coastline. This is not one battle. It's 3 landings happening at once. To north at Port Hay, 9,000 men of the 60th Infantry Regiment go ashore behind the battleship USS Texas and the light cruiser USS Savannah, aiming to grab an airfield. To the south at the phosphate port of Safi, 6,500 men of the 47th Infantry, backed by the warship USS New York and the cruiser USS Philadelphia, land to cover Casablanca's southern approaches. And in the center, 15 miles northeast of Casablanca, at a resort town called Bidala, the main event: 19,500 men of the 3rd Infantry Division. The force Patton and Hewitt are riding with personally. Screening the center group and ready to fight for Casablanca itself is a covering force built around one battleship, USS Massachusetts. The heavy cruisers USS Wichita and USS Tuscaloosa, with destroyers Myrant, Rind, Wainwright, and Jenkins. Air cover comes from the carrier Ranger and the escort carrier Swanee, operating 80 miles offshore. Hewitt's flagship Augusta and the light cruiser Brooklyn ride closer in, directly over the transports. On paper, against what France has in Morocco, this isn't a fair fight. It was never supposed to need to be. What Michelia actually has in Casablanca Harbor on the morning of the 8th. The light cruiser Premongue, 2 flotilla leaders, 7 destroyers, 2 of them, Simon and Tempete, already laid up from a collision and unable to sortie, 8 sloops, 11 minesweepers, and 11 submarines. And the wild card, Jean Bar, a brand new French battleship that escaped the Saint Nazaire shipyards, one step ahead of the German army in 1940. Still only 77% complete, immobile, with just one of her 4 main gun turrets wired up and operational. A single quadruple mount of 380 millimeter guns, the largest naval guns anywhere on this coast, backing the fleet. The L. Hank Coastal Battery, 4 194 millimeter guns and 4 138 millimeter guns dug into the high ground west of the harbor. Now, the landing itself, because it goes wrong almost immediately, and not because of the French. Loaded landing craft leave the line of departure at 0600. And the darkness that hid Task Force 34 all the way across the Atlantic turns out to be just as dangerous to the men trying to use it. The destroyer Wilkes and a scout boat marking one of the beaches swerve off station, dodging a unidentified boat that they couldn't identify as friend or foe. Landing craft run onto rocks at full speed rather than finding their marked beaches. From the transport Leonard Wood alone, 21 of 32 landing craft are wrecked before a single French shell has been fired at them. 8 more of her surviving boats get smashed in the surf on later runs. This is what amphibious warfare actually looks like in November of 1942. The U.S. Navy never has really done this before, at least not at this scale, and not against a defended shore. And the price of the learning curve gets paid in landing craft and soon enough in men. By dawn, roughly 3,500 American troops are ashore, hidden from French eyes by a morning mist that is doing double duty, concealing the landing force's true size from Michelier's spotters, and concealing the scale of the disaster among the landing craft from Hewitt's own staff. Just after 0700, the coastal batteries flanking Fadala Beach opened fire on the landing craft. 4 138 millimeter guns at a position called Point Blondon to the east, and a mixed battery of smaller guns sheltering the western end of the beach. At 0720, Hewitt authorizes 4 American destroyers standing close inshore to fire back. The theory that the French wouldn't fight had just failed its first test, in real time, with American troops still wading through surf. 2 of those destroyers, Ludlow and Murphy, take damage almost immediately from the French shore batteries. And it's the heavier guns of Augusta and Brooklyn, standing further out over the anchored transports, that come to their aid 5 minutes later. Ludlow and Wilkes eventually pound the Point Blondon battery into silence. Augusta silences the Fidala battery on her own. Just before 0 Just before 0800, Murphy and Wainwright drive off two French aircraft that make a run at the ships. The landing has started. Nobody stood aside, and out past the harbor mouth, 5 French submarines are already getting underway.
I anticipated that they would get fired upon. Otherwise, this would be a very boring story. But what a I just imagine the conflicted feelings, you know? I'm sure the French military was not excited to follow the orders of the German high command. And seeing an ally in the water, or at least a former ally, I guess current ally, I don't know how you would say that. A political ally who currently is in a gosh, I can't speak today. This is a very confused relationship at the moment. And so he has to do his duty. He's a military man, and that's what you do. And I'm sure he has very mixed feelings about doing that. I wonder what the consequence would be if he did nothing. I know we've seen in the past, and we've talked about in previous episodes, where people have refused to exercise the commands that they have been given because they don't agree with them. I'm sure there would have been a severe consequence. Anyway, this is when you're talking about Casablanca. I cannot visualize it without thinking of the movie that was filmed around this time. Like, the movie was filmed during wartime and was talking about real things. And so people, when they were watching that, they were realizing, yeah, this conflict is going on. This is about now. And they play the French national anthem, and the people there like have visible reactions because they hadn't heard that in years, and they're French people that get emotional about it. And so when I think about the history just in that movie and how it pertains to what's happening in this conflict now, there are French people that want to be fully French and can't be because they've been taken over. And so this is just, it's like a tragedy.
5 French submarines: Amazon, Antiope, Meduse, Orphée, and Sibylle slip out of Casablanca harbor and fan out to defensive patrol stations. Somewhere out there, 11 American destroyers and a battleship are about to become their hunting ground. And not one of those submarine crews knows yet whether they're about to fight the war they trained for or a war nobody back in Vichy ever explained to them. At 0750, French fighters scramble to intercept a formation of American bombers inbound from Ranger and Swanee. What follows is a straight air-to-air dogfight over a country that is, on paper, at peace with a nation whose planes just showed up over its capital harbor. French Yuan-Tang fighters against American wildcats. Guns hot. 7 French aircraft going down against 4 or 5 American losses, depending on whose after-action report you trust. This is the first air battle Americans have fought against a European flag other than Germany's or Italy's in this entire war. There is no combat doctrine that fully accounts for what it means to shoot down a plane flown by a country you're not at war with. The pilots of both sides just did their jobs anyway. At 0804, the bombs start falling on Casablanca harbor itself. And this is where the invasion stops being an abstraction. 10 civilian freighters and passenger liners, vessels with no more military value than any port city's merchant fleet, are sunk at their moorings in the opening strikes. 3 more French submarines, off retreat, Oread and La Pesche, are destroyed, tied up at the dock before their crews can even get them underway. Hulls torn open where they sit. If you're looking for the human cost of liberation delivered by dive bomber, this is it. Merchant sailors and dock workers in a neutral colonial port, killed by the country that will, within the year, be calling their nation an ally again. Historians disagree about how much of this could have been avoided with better pre-invasion coordination with sympathetic French officers. What isn't in dispute is what happened, and that Casablanca's civilian population paid for a diplomatic failure they had no part in. Well, the harbor burns. The covering force finally shows itself off the coast. Massachusetts, Wichita, and Tuscaloosa, screened by the destroyers Myrant, Rind, Wainwright, and Jenkins. The moment they come into range, L. Hank's coastal gunners find them immediately. The very first French salvo straddles Massachusetts, meaning shells land close enough on both sides of the ship that the next adjustment could be a direct hit. That is world-class gunnery from a shore battery that's supposedly outmatched. And from the Jean Bart, sitting immobile at her mooring, the one working quadruple turret of 380 millimeter guns, they open up too. The most powerful weapon on this entire coast, manned by a skeleton crew on a ship that is still technically under construction. This is the moment I want you to sit with. An unfinished one turret, a crew that spent the last 2 years fitting her out rather than fighting in her. And she's about to trade fire with a fully worked up American battleship less than a year old. Because her orders say defend the neutrality of this port. And nobody in Vichy carved out an exception for old friends showing up under new pretenses. Massachusetts opened counter battery fire. This is the moment worth marking because it's a genuine first. The first American 16-inch armor-piercing shell fired in anger anywhere in the Second World War comes off Massachusetts' deck this morning, off the coast of a country the United States is not at war with, aimed at a battleship that isn't finished being built. Nobody who designed the South Dakota-class battleship program imagined its combat debut looking like this. By 0840, the covering force shifts its main attention to L. Hank itself, hammering the battery for the better part of 45 minutes. But out at Jean Bar's mooring, something has already gone wrong with the French. And we're going to spend the whole next section on exactly what, because the duel between an American battleship sitting still in a harbor is one of the strangest ship-to-ship actions of the entire Pacific and Atlantic War. And it deserves a full discussion. 5 French submarines are still out there hunting. The harbor is burning. Jean Bar's gun have gone quiet.
So you said there are over 100 American ships here, because it's not just all combat ships necessarily. A lot of them will be transports with Army personnel and whatnot, and I understand that. That is a lot of ships. And I'm sure the idea was the port here and make a landing. I am curious about this French battleship that is incomplete, yet possesses a giant gun. And I thought it was interesting that the coastal gunners were so accurate. That isn't necessarily a surprise. Most coastal gunners train for this kind of thing. But when you mentioned at the top of the episode how understaffed this seemed to be, like they were already at a disadvantage. They're understaffed skeleton crews, and this humongous American fleet is showing up. And they, like you say, have to defend the neutrality of this port. It's going to be a fight. I'm sure they will dedicate themselves well and put it all out there. I'm also curious what the French submarines do. That I'm sure the Americans anticipated submarines in the waters and have anti-submarine tactics ready to go. But, gosh, it is unfortunate that they have to fire upon a friend, and that the friend was put in this position, and I'll probably repeat that several times in this episode. I cannot wait to hear how mobile or what tactical advantages the incomplete battleship has. It can't be that great, but at the same time, it's so unique, this situation. So I keep telling us more. What happens?
Here's the picture. An American battleship built to fight the Imperial Japanese Navy across open Pacific water, trading fire at 22,000 meters with a French battleship that cannot move. Jean Bar fled the St. Nazaire shipyards in 1940 under her own power, incomplete, racing the advancing German army to open water. She made it out, one of the genuine escape stories of the fall of France. But escaped and finished are two very different words. 2.5 years later, she's still sitting at 77% complete in Casablanca Harbor. Her engines never fully installed, unable to get underway under her own power again. One of her four main turrets, designed to carry 16 380 millimeter guns total, only one is wired and crewed and operational, a single quadruple mount forward. The French Navy has turned an unfinished battleship into a stationary coastal fort. And on the morning of November 8th, that one turret is the most dangerous single weapon in French Morocco. Massachusetts opens fire at 22,000 meters, better than 13 miles at 0704 by American accounts, though French sources place it closer to 0804. A discrepancy that comes down to which side had adjusted their clocks to which time zone rather than any real dispute about what happened. Whichever clock you trust, this is the moment. The first 16-inch American shell of the Second World War fired at a target that can't run. Jean Barr's gunners got 7 rounds off. 7. Against a fully worked up American battleship with radar-assisted fire control and a trained crew that's done nothing but drill for this since commissioning. And on Massachusetts' 5th salvo, a 16-inch shell finds Jean Barr's turret and jams the rotating mechanism solid. The most powerful gun in Morocco goes silent. Not because the turret was destroyed, not because the crew broke, because a single hit welded the machinery that turns it. Now, I'm going to level with you here. Ship engineer to ship engineer. That's not a design failure on France's part. Any turret can be jammed by the right hit in the right place. What it tells you is that Jean Barr's never had the margin to absorb bad luck. A finished battleship eats that hit and keeps 3 other turrets in the fight. Jean Barr eats it and she's done for the day. And here's a detail that belongs in every naval history footnote and almost never makes it in. A meaningful number of Massachusetts 16-inch shells that hit Jean Barr that morning simply don't go off. Not because the guns misfired, not because the aim was bad, but because the fuses screwed into those shells had been manufactured in 1918. 24-year-old ordnance pulled out of some Navy magazine because the fleet expanded faster than fuse production could keep pace with in the run-up to war. And a fair number of them were duds by the time they finally got used in anger. You can put a 2,700-pound armor-piercing shell dead on target and still not get the damage you paid for if the fuse inside it has been sitting in a warehouse since Woodrow Wilson was president. That's not a story about French incompetence. That's a story about American industrial mobilization still catching up to the size of the war it had to fight. 4 years after those fuses were built and less than a year after Pearl Harbor. Even with the jam turret and the dud shells, Jean Barr is not finished. Not yet. Her crew works through the day, and by sundown on the 8th, workmen have freed the turret mechanism and gotten it turning again. An unfinished battleship, crewed by men who spent 2 years as ship fitters more than sailors, took the best the U.S. Navy's newest battleship could throw at her, lost her only working weapon for most of a day, and had it back in action by nightfall. Whatever else this battle is, it's not a story about French Navy failing to fight. L. Hank's guns, meanwhile, kept firing through the covering force's counter-battery barrage from 0840 to 0925. And by the time the exchange winds down, neither the coastal battery nor Jean Bart have been silenced for good. This fight is not over. It's barely started. And while Massachusetts and Jean Bart have been trading the morning's heaviest blows, 7 more warships have been getting up steam in the harbor behind them. Because the destroyers are about to come out.
This is wild. So I'm glad you kept answering my questions that kept popping up as you continued, and I'm like, oh, great, don't have to ask that. So well done, you. I find it interesting that, yeah, incomplete battleship's not going to be sailing. Makes sense. It's a defensive, fixed defensive position. I was thinking that hit was so perfect. Like it didn't, it disabled the weapon. It didn't have any quote unquote unnecessary casualties. But by not killing the team there, they were able to repair the gun and bring it back in action. So what would have been better? You know, I guess it would have been better to completely demolish the gun and possibly kill the crew. And I hate saying that because, again, I don't think the Americans want to, but they're forced in this position to do so because they need to get on shore. How long? So I didn't hear any aircraft carriers in this fleet, and you're not talking about planes launching, right? Or have we gotten to that section yet?
We've already talked about the American aircraft launching off and dropping
Dang
bombs on the
it.
harbor. Yes, we have. And a
Okay,
dogfight
good.
over the harbor.
I'm trying to get a scope of the battle, and there seems to be so much going on against an undermanned defense, but they still seem to be holding their own. How long do defensive batteries, coastal defenses, I should say, in the World War II era, how long do they typically last? I mean, is that a question that can be answered?
It just depends on the situation. It depends on the coastal battery, depends on the attacking force. There's too many variables that can happen to be able to give
Yeah,
you a accurate answer.
I I get that. I guess yeah. I'm again trying to picture all the pieces working as if I'm watching a movie. And then with these French ships coming out of the harbor ready to face the Americans, it like even more chaos is unfolding. And I know it's not pure chaos because there's going to be tactics, there's going to be strategic movements of ships to try to counter the other. This is quite not a mess. It's not unexpected. Again, all of this stuff is known, all the quantities of ships that are in the harbor that the Americans are having to face, they know about this. But it's and the resistance again expected. This is what they kind of have to do. Sorry. This is so frustrating. I don't want the Americans and French to fight. Anyway, let's see what happens.
Well, while the covering force is still hammering El Hank, the harbor mouth at Casablanca opens up and 7 ships of the French 2nd Light Squadron come out through their own smoke screen, headed straight for the American transport sitting off Vidala. 19,500 soldiers worth of ships, nearly undefended against a torpedo run because most of the heavy metal is out fighting El Hank and Jean Bar. This is the moment every officer on those transports has been dreading since the landing craft first hit the water. A destroyer squadron loose among the transports with torpedoes can undo an entire invasion in about 15 minutes. The lead ship is the flotilla leader, Milan, pushing through the smoke with the destroyers Fugo and Boulonnais close behind. At 0920, fighters off Ranger dive on the formation. Strafing runs through the smoke that can't sink a destroyer but can rake her open decks and rattle her gun crews. It isn't enough to stop them. French gunners sink one of the American landing craft outright and puts hit on the destroyer Ludlow, already damaged once this morning. Milan takes the worst of it, hit by the destroyer Wilkes and then by the heavy cruiser Wichita and Tuscaloosa. She runs herself onto the beach rather than go down in open water, deliberately grounding to save what's left of her crew. That's not cowardice. That's a captain doing the math on how many of his sailors he can save by trading his ship for their lives and making the call in under a minute with 3 American warships putting rounds into her hull. Massachusetts Tuscaloosa turned their guns on Farragut at 1000 and on Bolaños 12 minutes later. Farragut takes the worst of a battleship's secondary batteries and goes down at 1040. She simply blows apart and sinks. taking most of her crew down with her before rescue is even possible. This is a 1,378-ton destroyer against guns designed to punch through battleship armor. There was never a version of this exchange the French destroyer was going to win. What there was a French crew that sortied anyway into a fight their own commanders almost certainly knew was unwinnable, because the alternative was letting American transports sit there unmolested while their own countrymen ashore fought and died without the Navy even trying to help them. And in the middle of all this, and I'm going to give you this one because it's the kind of detail that reminds you there's always a strange, almost darkly funny footnote hiding inside the worst days of a war. Major General George Patton very nearly loses his ride to the beach before he ever sets foot in Morocco. His landing boat has been swung out on davits alongside Augusta, ready to lower him ashore when the cruiser's own 8-inch gun fires a broadside close by. The muzzle blast alone, just the concussion of Augusta's gun firing, blows the bottom clean out of Patton's boat. Most of his personal luggage goes over the side and into the Atlantic. The most famous armored commander in the American Army very nearly loses his uniforms to friendly fire before he's fired a shot of his own. By noon, Augusta finishes off Boulogne. And of the 7 ships that sortied from that harbor 2 hours earlier, only the destroyer Lycion remains fully operational. Milan is beached and burning. Forgru is on the bottom. Bolianas is sunk. In the space of about 3 hours, the French 2nd Light Squadron has been effectively erased as a fighting force. And every single ship in it went out anyway, to overwhelming American gunfire, because standing in port while the invasion continued unopposed wasn't a choice their orders or their honor would let them make. Early that afternoon, 3 small French warships tried to slip back out of the harbor on a rescue mission. Not an attack, a rescue, trying to pull survivors out of the water before they drown or freeze. The American covering force turns them back with shell fire anyway. War doesn't always leave room to tell the difference between a combatant and a rescue boat in time to hold fire. And that's one of the uglier truths this battle forces you to sit with rather than sanitize. The 2nd Light Squadron is finished, but out in the harbor, one more French ship is getting up steam, the light cruiser Primalgat, and she's about to make the bravest and most doomed sortie of the entire battle.
When you were mentioning how the Navy had a choice, the French Navy, to go and fight or to not, like just to let the Americans land unmolested. But the choice was, if they did that, others would have to fight and die in their place. And that's what kind of sealed the deal of, well, no, we can't let that happen. We have to go. We have to try to repel this as best we can in the face of overwhelming numbers and firepower and modern weaponry, right? Like you were mentioning that one of the battleships was a year old, South Dakota class, and that's going to operate so much better than anything that the French have. And they still went out. They still did their duty. They still maintained their honor, and they did their best with what they had in the face of just a lopsided battle. And as you kept mentioning, like the captain beached his ship to save more soldiers, or they strategically moved certain ways because honor compelled them to, or that's the best that they could do. Those are the details of the stories that I particularly like when we discuss conflicts in this podcast, because what is going through their mind? What do they have to do? What are they forced to do many times? And it's nice to see people operate with honor and considering their men that are under their command. Yeah, this is just a mess. I don't know if I've mentioned that. It's a mess. But the Americans seem to be systematically dismantling the obstacles and making way to achieve their goal, and that's unloading Patton's force. I'm guessing as the ships start getting disabled or destroyed, the French ships. That one crew on the Jean Bar is still working to get that turret back up and going. And you mentioned it gets repaired by the evening. And so I'm sure while all this fighting is going on, they're still working. And I'm curious to see when this comes back into play, because I know it will, and I know it'll be devastating.
Try to put yourself in the mind of Rear Admiral Gervais de Lafond as he takes the light cruiser Primogay out through the harbor mouth sometime after 1000 on November 8th. His flotilla leader is already beached and burning. Two of his destroyers are sunk or sinking. Everything that's gone out this morning has been outranged and cut to pieces by an American covering force that came prepared for exactly this. And he takes his cruiser out anyway, with the flotilla leader, Albatross, and the destroyers Restois and Founder alongside her. Here's what makes this sortie different from everything that came before it. And it's a detail I want on the record before anyone judges the French Navy's performance this morning. Primogay was in refit, not fully operational, not worked up. A warship pulled out of a maintenance yard and thrown into a fleet action against an enemy covering force built around a battleship and two heavy cruisers. Because there was nothing else left in the harbor capable of making. This is not a fair fight, and it was never going to be one. Every man aboard those four ships almost certainly knew it before they break water. Massachusetts engages first, and Primogay, undercrewed, under-repaired, fighting a battleship with a cruiser that wasn't supposed to be at sea at all, returns fire anyway. That's the detail that matters here. Outgunned isn't the same as not fighting. From 1100 to 1120, Augusta and Brooklyn add their guns to the engagement. And at that point, the outcome stops being in doubt. Albatross, taking hits from 3 American cruisers and carrier aircraft simultaneously, runs herself aground rather than sink in open water. The same calculation Milan made an hour earlier, the captain choosing to save his crew over saving his ship. The 2 destroyers with her are driven back into the harbor and capsized there. Primogay herself limps back into Casablanca harbor, runs aground, and burns. 45 of her crew are killed. More than 200 are wounded. And a light cruiser with a normal wartime complement, well under 600 men. That is the casualty rate that would break most crews' will to keep the ship in the fight. And hers kept firing until she couldn't anymore. This is a moment in the episode where I am not going to pretend the moral picture is simple, because it isn't. These are French sailors, men who, in a different set of political circumstances, in a war that made a different kind of sense, would very plausibly be fighting alongside the United States rather than against it. 20 months later, French forces liberated from Vichy control will be fighting in Italy and landing in southern France as full Allied partners. The men dying aboard Primogay this morning are, in some very real sense, casualties of a diplomatic failure and a legal fiction. An armistice obligation that turned natural allies into enemies for one violent morning off the Moroccan coast. That doesn't make the American gunnery wrong. Task Force 34 had 35,000 soldiers to get ashore, and a French squadron bearing down on the transports carrying them. But it also doesn't make it clean. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you it was. While the surface action burns itself out, the French submarine, Amazon, fires a torpedo salvo at Brooklyn and misses. And somewhere on patrol between Casablanca and Fedela, the submarine Cybele simply vanishes. No confirmed American attack claims her. No wreck was found for decades. She's listed as lost with all hands, cause unknown. One of the small, unresolved tragedies that sit inside every large naval battle. A crew that went out on patrol and never checked back in. And nobody on either side can tell you exactly what happened to them. 2 more French submarines, Cida Faroche and Le Conray-Ron get out of the harbor without torpedoes loaded, sent to sea unarmed rather than risk them being destroyed at their moorings like Amphitrite and the others were that morning. Le Tonon manages to load a handful of torpedoes before she clears the breakwater. Whatever is left of Michelier's navy is now burning on the beach, sunk or running for open water with half-empty torpedo tubes. By early afternoon, the surface battle for Casablanca harbor is effectively over. Jean Barr's turret is jammed but her crew is already working to free it. And the French submarine force, 5 boats, now scattered and hunting in open water, is the only card Michelier has left to play.
Nice rhyme. Yeah, this is a mess. I keep coming back to that. I appreciate that you mentioned that the morality here it's not clean. I think that's the term used, and that's appropriate. War is a fickle animal, and when you have an objective and there are those in your way, sometimes you need to push them out of your way, and that's what's happening. That those torpedoes missed, I kept waiting for the landing craft to be struck by a torpedo or sunk, and just how differently would the North African campaign have gone with a whole transport ship worth of men and equipment sunk, like that much fewer or that much less to work with.
Dawn on November 9th brings 6-foot waves onto the Fedala beaches. And if you want to understand how close this invasion comes to logistical collapse without a single additional French shell being fired, this is the morning to look at. 40% of the invading troops are ashore. 1% of their supplies has made it off the transports and onto the beach with them. Ammunition is running short in forward positions. There isn't enough medical equipment ashore to handle the previous day's wounded properly. Radio sets are still sitting in the holds of transport ships instead of in the hands of the officers who need to coordinate and advance. So units are trying to fight a battle without being able to reliably talk to each other. The advance on Casablanca itself simply stalls. Not because the French stopped it, but because there's no mechanized equipment ashore yet to move what little supply has landed. An invasion force that outguns its opponent by every measure that matters can still be strangled by its own logistics. And November 9th is a hard lesson in exactly that. At 1000, 2 French sloops, Commandant Delage and La Grazios, sortie from the harbor to open fire on American troops advancing towards Casablanca's outskirts. Small ships, a few light guns each. No illusions about changing the outcome of the invasion. But they go out anyway. Because there are American soldiers advancing on French positions, and somebody in command still has ships that can shoot at them. Augusta and the destroyers Edison and Tillman chase the 2 sloops back towards the harbor, and then have to break off the pursuit themselves, driven back by gunfire from a battleship that was supposedly silenced the day before. On Bar, her crew worked through the night and got the jam turret's rotating mechanism freed by sundown on the 8th. Less than 24 hours after Massachusetts' 5th salvo jammed that turret solid. It's turning again and firing well enough to drive off 2 American destroyers and a cruiser. Say what you want about the tactical hopelessness of France's position at Casablanca. The damage control effort that got that turret back into action in under a day on a ship that was never fully commissioned by a crew that was still fitting her out 2 years into the war is first-rate seamanship. And I'm not going to let that one go unmarked just because it's the losing side. Now, it doesn't save her. At some point that afternoon, the exact hour is contested between American and French sources, but the outcome isn't. 9 dive bombers off Ranger roll in on Jean Bar with 1,000-pound bombs. 2 direct hits are enough. The battleship that survived a full caliber duel with Massachusetts the day before, that had her jammed turret back in action inside 24 hours, finally settles into the mud of Casablanca Harbor with her decks awash. Not destroyed outright, but done fighting, sitting on the bottom in shallow water, with the sea lapping at her main. It takes a battleship 48 hours and a battle group's worth of gunfire and dive bombers to finally put her down for good. And even then, she goes sitting upright in shallow water rather than rolling over and taking her crew with her. 22 of Jean Bar's sailors are killed across the 3 days of fight, a number that would be far higher if her captain, Athos, hadn't fought a defensive damage control focused action from the start rather than trying to do more than an incomplete battleship with one working turret could realistically manage. Out in open water, 3 more French submarines make their own last attempts. L'Étonnant and Antioch each fire torpedo salvos at Ranger, at Massachusetts, and at Tuscaloosa, respectively. And every single shot misses. Meduse pays for the attempt. American counterattacks cripple her badly enough that she has to beach herself off Cape Blanc rather than sink at sea. 3 submarines, 3 attacks, 3 misses, and 1 more French warship put out of the fight without a single American hull damaged by any of them. By the close of November 9th, Jean Bar is down. The 2nd Light Squadron is gone. Primauguet is a burned out wreck on the beach. And Michelieu is running out of a navy to fight this battle with. But the fighting on land hasn't stopped, and Casablanca itself hasn't surrendered yet.
I find that really interesting. The shout out to the engineering crew, very justified. That was a crazy amount of work that they were able to pull off and get it back in action. The sloops, when you said sloops, I was confused because those are sailing vessels, ladies and gentlemen. I know that much. But I think the attitude that you're implying or may have explicitly said of Michelieu noting, hey, as long as I have ships to fight with, I'm fighting, and does so. And it is clear that the sloops aren't going to do very much against modern cruisers and destroyers, battleships, completely outclassed. But the bravery of the sailors and the commitment of the command to do so, to do everything they can to the process is pretty exemplary. And I think when you think about your side doing that, like if the Americans were in some pitched battle and it was clear they were going to lose, but they threw everything they had as best they could and were disciplined, we would celebrate that, and justifiably so. And I'm very impressed with how that's all going down. And it is amazing that every single torpedo misses. I guess the doctrine with submarines is there's not communication back and forth between commands. So were the torpedoes on target? Were they purposefully missed? We don't know. But thankfully for the Americans, they didn't hit. This is a mess. Sorry, go ahead.
Casablanca surrenders on November 11th, 1942. And this is where the naval battle of Casablanca does something that most battle narratives never have to reckon with. The deadliest strikes of the entire fight land after the enemy has already quit. When the surrender comes, roughly 11,000 tons of supply, 3/4 of everything the invasion force brought for its own soldiers, is still sitting aboard the transport ships because the landing has gone so slowly and so badly that the logistics never caught up with the fighting. Those transports have to stay anchored off Fidala to finish unloading. In a stretch of water that Michelet's navy no longer had any meaningful ability to threaten. But somebody else does. German U-boats, alerted days earlier by early reports of an Allied convoy gathering off Gibraltar, have been racing across the Atlantic since October 29th, delayed by mechanical trouble and, in at least one case, battle damage sustained en route. They're arriving off Morocco right around the moment the French quit fighting, which means the invasion fleet, no longer worried about French coastal guns or French destroyers, is about to get hit by an enemy nobody in Task Force 34's planning ever fully accounted for showing up this fast. On the evening of November 11th, the very day of the surrender, the German submarine U-1 finds the anchorage. In a single attack, she torpedoes the destroyer Hambleton, the oiler Winooski, and the troop ship Joseph Hughes. Around 100 men go down with Joseph Hughes alone. The destroyer Bristol spots a surface submarine shortly after, engages with deck guns and depth charges, but there's no confirmation she sank anything. The U-boat likely survives to hunt another day. That same day, Shawnee's torpedo bombers catch and sink the French submarine Sidi Farouche, one of the last operational boats Michelieu has sent to sea. The fleet stays at anchor, still trying to finish unloading, still waiting for a follow-up convoy codenamed UGF-2. And on the evening of November 12th, U-130, commanded by Ernst Kloss, finds the anchorage too. In one attack run, Kloss sinks 3 troop ships outright: Tasker H. Bliss, Hugh L. Scott, and Edward Rutledge. 74 more American servicemen die. Between the 2 U-boat attacks, 4 troop ships, and dozens of tons of supplies meant to support the invasion of a country that has already surrendered end up on the bottom of the Atlantic. And roughly 147 American sailors and soldiers die across the whole battle. And a meaningful share of that number comes from these 2 nights, after the shooting war with France was supposed to be over. Sit with that for a second, because it's the cruelest irony this battle has to offer. Vice Admiral Michelieu's Navy fought as hard as any force we have ever covered on this show. Fremonget went out undercrewed and outgunned rather than sit in port. Jean Barre got a jammed turret back into action in under a day. Milan and Albatross beached themselves to save their crews rather than sink with them. And for all of that fighting, French guns and French torpedoes never sank a single American troop ship. It's Germany. The power Vichy France was legally obligated to defend Moroccan neutrality against invasion on behalf of. That inflicts the invasion fleet's worst single losses. 3 days after the French have already surrendered and stopped shooting. The undamaged troop ships finally break from the exposed anchorage, maneuvering evasively at sea until they can moor in the shelter of the Casablanca breakwater on November 13th and finish unloading in relative safety. The last of France's scattered submarines meet their own ends over the following days. Conrad is caught on the surface and sunk on the 13th by 2 PBY Catalina flying boats off Villa Signos, hundreds of miles down the coast. Le Tonon, her fuel and options both running out, is scuttled off Cadiz, Spain, on the 15th rather than let her fall into anyone's hands. And on November 16th, American destroyers finally corner and sink U-173 off Casablanca, closing the loop on the submarine that killed 100 Americans 4 days earlier, and marking, by most accountings, the last shot fired in the naval battle of Casablanca. 8 days, a battleship duel, 3 destroyer actions, a cruiser's death ride, 11 French submarines hunted across 3 days of open water. And in the end is a German U-boat captain named Ernst Kloss, who inflicts the single deadliest blow of the entire fight on ships that were only still sitting in that anchorage because the invasion had gone slower than anyone planned.
That is, I keep thinking that's almost Twilight Zone-esque irony. You finally finish the conflict in the port by Casablanca. Things are unloading. It's taking a while, but relief, I'm sure, is setting in for a lot of Americans at this point because, like you said, just a few days later, I think November 11th, they surrender things are happening, and then seemingly out of nowhere, the U-boat strikes. And that must be devastating. It's hard for me to imagine the constant vigilance that needed to take place during this conflict. Whether you're transporting stuff over the Atlantic, you're about to engage in a battle, you're in the process of unloading. Every single step of the way, there's danger all over the place, and every victory is just a minor boost. But even then, in victory, things can go down, and you have to be always on guard, and that's so difficult. And it's hard for me to, like I said, put myself in that position to think about that. But that's what sailors, uh, military members of all stripes have to do in wartime. And so, thank you for bearing the burden, ladies and gentlemen, and Dale. That just seems so difficult. I'm glad they were able to get on the beach. Hooray, America. And I'm glad they were able to tie up the loose ends. That's something that you don't always get a chance to do. But with the French submarines and then also the German submarine, everything just kind of a closed loop and you're able to continue. That's always beneficial. Wow, what a story.
Now, I want to back up and put a name on the deal that actually stopped the shooting on November 11th, because it's uglier and more complicated than the French surrendered. And it deserves a full discussion than a passing mention. The man who signs the armistice isn't Michelieu, and it isn't a Casablanca's military governor. It's Admiral Francois Darlan, commander-in-chief of all Vichy French armed forces. One of the most senior men in the entire Vichy government, who happens, by pure coincidence, to be in Algiers, visiting his sick son when the invasion begins. General Dwight Eisenhower, desperate to stop French resistance across all 3 landing sites before it costs more American lives, makes Darlan an offer. Recognize him as a legitimate French authority in North Africa. Let him keep command of French forces there, and in exchange, Darlan orders every French unit under his authority, Army, Navy, Air Force, to lay down arms and cooperate with the Allies. Darlan takes the deal. Casablanca surrenders on the 11th. Fighting across French North Africa largely stops within days. And by any narrow military measure, it works exactly as intended. It saves American and French lives that would otherwise have been spent finishing a fight nobody on the Allied side actually wanted in the first place. Here's the problem, and it's a real one, not a footnote. Francois Darlan is not some reluctant bureaucrat who got swept up in circumstances beyond his control. He is a committed Vichy loyalist, a man who spent 2 years actively collaborating with Nazi Germany, negotiating naval and colonial concessions to Berlin, and defending the same armistice obligations that just cost hundreds of French sailors their lives, defending Casablanca against the very allies he's now switching sides to join. The deal Eisenhower cuts effectively rewards him for it. Hands him a position of Allied-backed authority in exchange for calling off a fight his own government started. Roosevelt himself calls the arrangement a, quote, temporary expedient, which is Washington speak for, we know exactly how this looks and we're doing it anyway. British officials are furious. American newspapers are furious. Free French leader Charles de Gaulle, who has spent 2 years in London building a resistance movement, out of exactly the officers who refused to sign Vichy's armistice, is beyond furious. Watching the Allies hand real power to the very man his movement exists to oppose. This is the moment in the episode where I am not going to soften it for you. War makes you cut deals with people you'd otherwise refuse to sit in a room with, because the alternative is more of your own men coming home in bags. That's true. And it was true on November 11th, 1942. and it doesn't make the deal clean. It doesn't erase what Darlan did for 2 years before that morning. And it doesn't erase the fact that French sailors on Primoguet and Jean Bar died 3 days earlier, enforcing the very obligations Darlan is now abandoning for his own political survival. Both things are true at once. The armistice probably saved lives, and the man who signed it does not deserve a hero's ending. He doesn't get one. 6 weeks after Casablanca surrenders, on December 24th, 1942, a young French royalist assassinates Darlan in his Algiers headquarters. He never lives to see how history judges the deal that bears his name. And historians are still arguing about it 80 some years later, whether Eisenhower had any real alternative, whether the Darlan deal set a troubling precedent for wartime pragmatism trumping moral clarity, whether it mattered at all in the long run once de Gaulle's Free French absorbed most of the same forces within the year, regardless. What matters for this episode is narrower and more concrete. The armistice Darlan signs on November 11th is the direct reason the shooting stops at Casablanca. And it's the reason the story shifts in its final days from French guns to German torpedoes. Because once Darlan's order takes effect, the only enemy left in these waters wears a different uniform entirely.
I am so glad that you bring up the items that require nuance and the part. Just I keep thinking about the history classes I attended in high school and college, and how it was side A, side B, conflict. Here's the outcome, and that was pretty much it. And then a date. You'd remember the date that it happened. But especially with war, it's always so much more complex. It's always there and so much more human. You tend to bring in the stories of the people involved, what they had to deal with, what they faced, the decisions that were made on the ground and at the top. And this decision, like this guy was working, I don't know. I don't know where to begin with this guy. I'm glad he signed the armistice. That that did help both France and America. And I'm curious, once he's assassinated later, do they do the French and the Germans attempt to revisit that? Or it's curious to me that that holds, you know what I mean? And Stoli needs to worry about the Axis forces at this point. It just reminds me of having to deal with Stalin. You know, I'm sure America would normally not want to sit in a room with a butcher of his own people, but war makes strange bedfellows, and that is precisely what this admiral had to deal with as well. Gosh, I'm glad this mess is over. This was quite a. It's so interesting because you were talking about John Barr, the guys that were firing the gun, repairing the gun, firing, and then ultimately defeated, lives lost, and then just days later, it's like, oh yeah, y'all don't need to fight. We're changing it. Armistice with America. There we go. You don't need to fight anymore. And it seems like such a waste. It seems like such a waste that all these guys had to die just days before, but that's what leads to decisions like that, right? If that pain wasn't there, would the armistice have come? Probably not. And that's unfortunate. And I'm glad you bring it up because it is a fact of war. It is a reality, and it needs to be talked about and remembered. Thank you, Dale.
8 days. That's the whole span of the naval battle of Casablanca, start to finish. November 8th through the 16th, 1942. And in those 8 days, you can find nearly every kind of naval combat the Second World War had to offer: battleship duel, destroyer action, cruiser sortie, submarine warfare on both sides, coastal artillery, carrier airstrikes, even a U-boat hunt to close it out. No other single battle in American naval history packs that much variety into that short a window. So, what did it actually buy? Strategically, Casablanca and the wider Operation Torch belongs to hand the Allies their first Atlantic-facing port in the African coast at exactly the moment they needed one. A staging base that, within 9 months, feeds the buildup for the invasion of Sicily and a long Allied campaign up the Italian peninsula. It's the debut of American ground and naval forces fighting a major combined operation in the European theater. The first large scale test of Anglo American amphibious doctrine that will get refined painfully all the way through Salerno, Anzio, and eventually Normandy. Every hard lesson Task Force 34 learned about landing craft in the dark, about logistics, outrunning supply, and what it costs to assault a defended beach, even against an outmatched opponent. Every one of those lessons gets carried forward and applied by the same Navy less than 2 years later on a much larger, much bloodier beach in France. Casablanca is where the U.S. Navy pays its amphibious warfare tuition. Normandy is where it collects on the education. And here's the recognition argument, because this battle deserves more attention than it generally gets. Ask 10 people to name a naval battle of World War II, and you'll get Midway, Pearl Harbor, maybe Leyte Gulf, maybe even the Coral Sea. Almost nobody reaches for Casablanca because it gets swallowed by two things at once. It happened in the Mediterranean theater, which has spent 80 years living in Normandy's shadow in American popular memory, and it was fought against France, a country that becomes an ally again within the year, which makes it an awkward story to tell at a victory parade. But awkward doesn't mean unimportant. This is the only time in the entire war that a U.S. Navy battleship fought a fleet action against a European power other than Germany or Italy. It's the first time American 16-inch guns fired at an enemy in anger in this war. And it's a battle that forces you to hold two things in your head at once without flinching from either one. That the men on both sides fought with genuine courage, and that the whole engagement was, at its root, a tragedy of bad timing and worse diplomacy that didn't have to happen the way it did. So, before Christoph closes us out, I want to name some names, because that's what this show owes the men who are actually there. On the American side, 174 dead across 8 days, a number that includes the roughly 100 men lost with the troop ship Joseph Hughes on November 11th, and the 74 more killed 2 nights later when U-130 sent Tasker H. Bliss, Hugh L. Scott, and Edward Rutledge to the bottom. Sailors and soldiers killed, not by the enemy they came to fight, but by a German submarine campaign that arrived almost as an afterthought to everyone's planning and still took more American lives in 2 nights than the entire French Navy managed in 3 days of open combat. On the French side, 462 dead. And I want specific numbers on the record rather than a round figure that erases individuals. 45 men killed aboard the light cruiser Premonge, more than 200 wounded alongside them, on a ship that went out undercrewed and outgunned rather than sit in harbor, while the invasion continued unopposed. 22 men killed aboard the battleship Jean Bart, a ship that was never even finished being built, whose damage control crew fixed a jammed main turret in under a day and kept fighting anyway. Crews aboard Foucault, Boulonnais, and Albatross. 5 ships that went out against a battleship and 3 cruisers because their orders said defend, with no exception written in for old friends showing up under a new flag of convenience. These were not men fighting for a cause history remembers kindly. Vichy France does not get a monument in most people's memory of World War II. And in most tellings, it doesn't deserve one. But the individual sailors who died defending Casablanca's neutrality on November 8, 1942, were men following legal orders from their own government, fighting with real skill and real courage against a fleet that outgunned them in every category that mattered, and dying in a fight that both sides, 20 months later, would be fighting on the same side of. That contradiction doesn't get resolved by this episode, and it shouldn't. It gets remembered honestly, which is the only tribute this show knows how to pay.
That was excellently said. And what a wonderful way to go out. I will remember the Battle of Casablanca now, something that before today I had not really heard of at all, and now will stay with me. And I hope, listener, you learned something as well. It's always great to come together and review what happened in the reality and what we can draw from it. I really appreciate you listening and tuning in. I guess that's such an old timey phrase. You don't tune in, choosing to
It works.
play the.
It still works.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Thanks for tuning in, y'all. And we see the numbers every week, and it's so wonderful to see you coming back and more people listening and you're sharing, and we thank you. If you ever want to get a hold of us, maybe you have a family member who was in this conflict, and you're like, oh, finally somebody talked about it, and I can talk about my grandfather or great grandfather and what he went through. Let us know. We would love to hear that. You can get a hold of us at the email address US Navy History USN History Pod, and you can find us there. Again, thank you for listening. Feel free to share with anybody you think that might be interested in this. And don't forget to rate and review. That helps us also reach more ears and minds and hearts. Yeah, all those organs. And well, people, you know what I mean. So thank you so much, and we'll catch you next time.
And with that, fair winds and following seas. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.